In this video, we will journey into the history of Russia together. Let me explain to you how the Russians first emerged, their effects on the Turks, and how they shaped Central Asia, including all about Ivan the Terrible, on a map. Let's get started. To understand Russian history, you need to know the history of the Slavs. The term Slav that we use actually originates from the word slave, and they were the slaves of Europe. While Europe had not yet begun to bring slaves from Africa, or explore and colonize those regions, it was enslaving the Slavs, the Slavic people. The Slavs did not have significant settlements until the year 882. By the year 882, Prince Oleg of Novgorod is establishing the first Kievan Rus. Then we will also see this as the Novgorod Republic. You will see it in green on the map. After the Kievan Rus weakened and disintegrated, and let's say he gathers the Eastern Slavs from the north and south under his command, forming a single principality, the term empire would be too grand. By the year 945, they already have a capital, which is Kiev. Let me take you directly to the year 950. If you pay attention, there is no Mongol threat on the map in the west or in the east. By the year 1200, we will see the rapid advance of the Mongols. To their immediate south, there are the Cossacks, but the Cossacks will not have neighbors for a very long time. Their faith is Christianity, and they will particularly choose Orthodoxy. They are heavily influenced by Byzantine cultures. And by the year 1000, if you pay attention to the map, the Cossacks are no longer there. Immediately to their south, there are the Pechenegs. They will fight a lot with the Pechenegs. Later, they will fight a lot with the Turks. And when I go 100 years further, you do not see Kievan Rus. The Novgorod Republic is coming. The Slavic society is being divided into parts, and later they will transition into a structure known as the Moscow Principality by 1340. If we go a little east, we are in the year 1200. I am only moving forward 10 years, and now the Mongol threat is emerging. The Mongols are advancing so quickly that by the year 1220, they are rapidly moving from the existing Chinese territories towards the northern side of India. If we go a little further, you will notice that they reached as far as the Caspian Sea and even started to take small pieces from the Arabian Peninsula. Instead of advancing into the Arabian Peninsula, they are moving further into Europe. Now our Novgorod Republic and all the Slavs known as the Moscow Principality are neighbors of the existing history of Russia. And just 10 years further, when we reach 1250, they are both consuming the Slavs. The Russians are eating their ancestors, and they are also a threat in Eastern Europe. As you know, Genghis Khan divided his lands after his death. His grandson founded the Golden Horde in 1242. When we move forward 10 years, we see the Golden Horde as a neighbor to the Slavs, specifically the Novgorod Republic and the Moscow Principality. This neighborhood has lasted a long time. It also has a long border. During this time, they trade with each other. Sometimes they clash at the border. But the Slavs are at least slowing the westward advance of the Golden Horde state towards Scandinavia. By the year 1550, there was no longer a Golden Horde state, the Moscow Principality existed. What we call the Moscow Principality is actually the Duchy of Moscow. It is a state centered around Moscow and is the origin of present-day Russia. And the Moscow Principality transforms into the Russian Empire after this date. If you look now, the Cossacks, Kazan, and the current territories of Siberia, which is now the Siberian Khanate, are present. Of course, with Tsar Ivan IV, the Kievan Rus took on the name of the Russian Tsardom, and then Ivan IV transitioned into the period of Ivan the Terrible. By the year 1600, the Moscow Principality will have such a large territory. But first, let me take you back to 1453. When we go a little further down, they say that with the Ottoman conquest of Istanbul in 1453, the Eastern Roman Empire was indeed destroyed, but Fatih Sultan Mehmet is not its continuation. You know, Fatih Sultan Mehmet had such a claim. We are the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. Therefore, we are its successor. They add the Byzantine double-headed eagle to their flags in 1480. And they begin to claim that Europe should also dominate the Russians in 1550. They want to advance both towards the Mediterranean and into Asia. While progressing into Asia, they are determining several routes for themselves. The first is to move directly into Asia towards India. advancing from the territory of the Golden Horde into India. They want to advance to China through Siberia, and they want to move directly towards Indian territory through the Caucasus over Ottoman lands. The Russians, meaning Ivan the Terrible's desire, was to reach the Mediterranean and even the Ottoman territories as early as possible. However, in 1552, it expanded its own lands, the yellow-colored lands you see here, for the first time. We are in the year 1551, and when the year 1552 passes, you will notice that the Kazan territories were swallowed up as they were. And Russia saw its lands double in size for the first time, benefiting from exploration, exploiting a territory, and incorporating new areas, thus becoming wealthier. Just 3 years later, they besieged Astrakhan, the region between them and the Ottomans. They aimed to capture Astrakhan and gradually touch both the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. However, since Astrakhan was Muslim, it requested help from the Ottomans. The Ottomans, in response to this request for assistance, developed an idea of their own. They said, "Let us connect the Don and Volga rivers with a canal. Let the Russians stay above. Therefore, they cannot move downwards, and we will also expand the trade route from Turkestan to Astrakhan and Crimea by sea." The canal project was unsuccessful, and the Russians descended and captured Astrakhan just 2 years later. The terrifying faith of the Russians was neither stopping nor resting, and it had begun to become a nuisance for the Ottomans by incorporating different beliefs into their lands. Let me tell you that the Russians succeeded in the Volga and Don Canal in 1952. During this period, the Rurik dynasty governed the Russians. The Rurik lineage existed from 1157 to 1598. With the death of Tsar Fyodor in 1598, the Rurik dynasty was replaced by the Romanov dynasty. The Romanov dynasty continued until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Then, in 1918, Emperor Nicholas II and his family will be killed by the Bolsheviks or by. Out of 65 members, 47 will flee abroad. By the year 1600, the Russian Tsardom was advancing into Asia from the north. It had already reached up to the Baltic Sea. However, there were 3 ways for it to go down. The first was that the Poles, meaning the Polish-Lithuanians, would descend from above. From there, it would pass through Italy over Greece. This was very difficult. It had to fight through a lot of territory within Europe. The second one would pass right from here over the Black Sea through the Ottoman Straits. The third one would take the lands of the Cossacks, Bukhara, and Kievan Rus towards India and the ocean. Of course, it's not that easy. The warriors in the land we refer to as present-day Turkestan were very strong. Another aspect is, in present-day China, there was the Ming dynasty, and the Ming dynasty had 2 routes for selling products from Tibet to Europe. One would either pass through Ottoman and Safavid lands or through Russian lands. It was more profitable to pass through Russian lands. Therefore, trade was greatly supported in Russia. This is how Russia's initial wealth began. They offered themselves as an alternative to the Silk Road. By the time we reached 1610, a decade later, the Russians had begun to advance by seizing more land in the north. When we move 100 years forward from 1610 to 1710, Tsar Peter I is on the throne, and his conquests are very significant. He definitely wants the Mediterranean. It is trying to develop itself towards European conquests. But if you pay attention, it had already captured almost all of Asia in the north. They will now reach as far as Bering, the Chugwev Khanate, Cossacks, Bukhara, Khiva. And the Kokand Khanate are obstacles for them. Why are they obstacles? To move further south, to reach the fertile spices in India. During this time, they are taking their first territories from the Ottoman Empire. This is during the reign of Peter the Great. It is the Azov fortress. However, they cannot advance much. Even if they take it during Peter's time, they do not progress very far. And they are bringing the war to the Swedish side, because taking it to the north of Europe and entering the Baltic Sea, as well as reaching the sea from there, is a great advantage for them. Remember that during his time, the important thing was to dominate trade at sea and alternative trade on land along the Silk Road. They are building very strong fortifications along the borders, and now they decide that they need to acquire the lands of the Kyrgyz. If we move the years a bit forward, they gradually start to take land from the Cossacks and Turks. Meanwhile, there is the Dzungar dynasty, which is pressuring the Cossacks. In 1750, the Cossacks were caught between the Chinggisid dynasty, which are the descendants of the Mongols, and the Russians. In 1755, Chinese resolved the issue of the Cossacks, incorporating them into the Chinese dynasty. They destroyed the entire Chungar with an army of 50,000 men. As for the Cossacks, they had asked the Russians for help against the Chungars, and the Russians, along with the internal power struggle among the Cossacks, they lost a large part of their lands in 1800 due to conflicts. Catherine the Great ascended to the throne in 1762. During her reign, 518,000 kilometers of new territory was acquired. The Russians' desire to seize Leistan was actually a somewhat troublesome plan for the Ottomans. The reason for this was that I should take you back to the year 1750. As you can see, the lands of Leistan, namely Poland and Lithuania, have not yet been taken. Here, the Ottomans, as the still powerful protector of the region at that time, were aware that the Russians entering Europe through Leistan, meaning Poland and Lithuania, posed a significant problem. Because we will refer to it as the Austro-Hungarian Empire later, Austria wanted Vienna for itself. And the Ottoman-Russian wars began. The war was on three fronts. The first was the Mediterranean front. The Russians made an agreement with England and reached the Baltic Sea. And, let me show you, they reached the Baltic Sea with the agreement with England. And from there, all of Spain sailed around the Strait of Gibraltar and brought their ships close to the port of Cheshme. In 1770, they burned the Ottoman fleet, which was anchored in Cheshme overnight. The second front was the land front. The Russians attacked from 5 directions in 1777. The third front was the Crimean front. The Crimean Khanate was unable to defend itself. Crimea was similarly lost. The Ottoman Empire signed the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca. Here, I should mention that Crimea was the only autonomous region. But that area was incorporated into Russian lands just 10 years later. By 1790, the Ottoman Empire had lost the first major series of battles against the Russians. In 1787, the Ottomans declared war again. They were quite successful because the Russians captured fortresses in Rumelia. They killed 26,000 Turks. Anapa Castle and Ismail Castle are falling, and in 1792, a peace agreement is signed. We are completely relinquishing Crimea. And a somewhat safer region is forming for the Russians. If you notice on the map of Europe, even in a span of 10 years, the Ottomans have both influenced Leicester. Well, they are unable to help, and as a result, they are losing that area. Moreover, they are losing a bit more land in this region. By the year 1812, Napoleon emerges. Napoleon's aim is to end the trade that Tsar Alexander IV has with British merchants. Thus, he will cut off the money going to Britain. When the money going to Britain is cut off and trade is halted, it will force the United Kingdom to end the war it has entered. Therefore, the Russians decided to take action. Now, when we talk about 1812, it was particularly the peak year for Napoleon and the First French Empire, which would begin to decline in 1813 due to events in Russia. But the dark blue areas you see on the screen are already part of the French Empire, while the light blue areas are territories associated with the French Empire. In other words, Napoleon does not decide to advance into Russia out of nowhere. He moves forward from his own territories. He says that to the east, he is already at the borders, and there is Russia. He is fixated on the wealth of Russia. In fact, 100 years later, 130 years later, Hitler will similarly advance through the same borders. And again he will fixate on the wealth of Russia, just as I explained to you about world history in World War II. A large army was gathered. 680,000 soldiers entered Russian territory, with 300,000 reaching French lands. They began to advance from West Prussia into the interior of Russia. Napoleon's first battle took place in Smolensk, a location between Moscow and Kiev. He had very high expectations in this battle. However, the Russian army began to pretend they were defeated and started to withdraw. Napoleon was supposed to set up camp here and take control of this region. But then, on the day the Russian army retreated, courage came first. And as the Russian army withdrew, he began to advance, moving towards Moscow. While advancing towards Moscow, he noticed that the Russian army was burning and destroying everything in its path. They were poisoning the water wells and burning the fields. The French army was struggling with the cold, which became even harsher as they advanced, and they were also unable to find food. The Russian army retreated for exactly 3 months. Finally, Napoleon entered Moscow, and there was an interesting situation when he entered. He could not find an army to fight, nor a delegation to surrender the city. The city was empty. The city had been burned. The Russians had made a fool of Napoleon. The army was starving and had captured an empty city. He could not stay here any longer. On December 14, 1812, he left Russia. Napoleon's reputation had been severely damaged. He had both depleted his army over time, and upon returning to Europe, there was no trace left of that powerful army, nor of his reputation. For Russia, which was relieved from Napoleon's troubles, there was another issue immediately to the south. Do you know what this issue was? The division of the Bukhara, Khiva, and Kokand Khanates. Why? Because these lands were desired by China to the immediate west, the Ottomans on the other side, and also, if we look south, the British, who were gradually starting to invade India. There was a lot of valuable metal in these lands, and they were fertile lands. The Russians knew this. If they fought with the Chinese, they would never be able to advance westward. Therefore, in 1851, they signed a non-aggression pact with the Chinese. It was so effective that throughout history, the Chinese and Russians lived as amicably as possible. By the year 1876, the Russians first captured the Khiva Khanate. Within a decade, they took control of Bukhara and Hokalton. And now, only Afghanistan remained to the south. Interestingly, they had signed an agreement with the Chinese, because all of India was now under British control. Thus, the Chinese, English, and Russians had become neighbors. Bukhara remained dependent until the Soviet invasion in 1820. They became attached to them. The Khanates they captured in this region did not ensure the people's loyalty to them forever. Although they applied assimilation in terms of religion, language, and culture, and forcibly migrated the Russian people there, the population still did not give in. While the Russians were dealing with this issue in the south, they were actually at war with the Ottomans between 1877 and 1878. There was a war called the 93 War. Why 93? Because it corresponded to 1293 in the Rurik calendar. What was important here was that the Ottoman Empire was fighting on both the Balkan front and the Eastern front, and it was not very strong. If I take you to 1875, you will notice that the Ottoman Empire was strong both in the Balkans and on the eastern border. But you see, that just 10 years later, they began to lose most of these lands. He could not be at ease because they were always trying to exploit the Turkestan region with violence, oppression, and heavy taxes. There were continuous bloody uprisings in the south, and they suppressed those bloody uprisings with blood and massacres. On one hand, they wanted Afghanistan. By the year 1900, they managed to acquire a piece of land from the north of Afghanistan, as you can see. But you know, the importance of the year 1900, which is the period of World War I. Now, they cannot attack China, they cannot reach the sea from the south, India is under British control, they cannot completely defeat Afghanistan, and although the Ottoman Empire is weak, they cannot enter through it. Interestingly, as we move westward and eastward, they also got into trouble with the Japanese. In 1905, the Japanese requested a part of an island that belonged to Russia and began to advance gradually. This was a year-long war. It certainly defeats Japan. The progressive attitude of the Japanese has also been halted here. However, on one hand, there is World War I, and on the other hand, this war with the Japanese, while the Russians faced a very large territory. Let me show you. The Russians were unable to maintain order within their vast territory. The working classes and peasant classes were going on strikes and revolts. And before World War I ended, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred on October 25, 1917. It is also referred to as the October Revolution. This Bolshevik Revolution was the Russian Revolution, which overthrew the Tsarist regime and resulted in the establishment of the Soviet Union. By 1918, the peoples in the Turkestan region were under great oppression. Let me take you to 1991. You can see that they are slowly starting to lose territory, and later on, they experience significant losses. Let me show you the transition of 91-92. If you pay attention here, territories such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine are separating within itself. In fact, we experienced a similar situation in 1917. Don't forget the transition in 1991-92. I am taking you to 1917. Look at what happens a year after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. We quickly see the independence of these lands. Just as these lands remained independent during the transition of 1917-19, ironically, they also gained their independence during the transition of 1991-92. However, there is a difference in 1992. Kazakhstan emerges with a very large area, followed by Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. The year 1917 has another significance. Some territories taken from the Ottoman Empire were left to Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, allowing for their emergence and establishment. Let's go back to 1921. After the Bolsheviks achieved this revolution in 1921, Lenin believes they have fallen far behind in agriculture and the economy. He is distancing the people from primitive industry and agriculture. Gradually, he ensures the country's enrichment, until his death in 1924. Things are going even better during the Stalin era. In 1933, they create a 5-year development plan, and within the territory of the Socialist Soviet Republic Union, 4,500 factories and energy facilities are being built. Between 1938 and 1941, an additional 3,000 factories were using industrial resources. Thus, even before entering World War II, they had opened around 9,000 large-scale factories and energy facilities. Stalin is expanding economic power tenfold during his era, as well as industrial power. Before entering World War II, they opened nearly 6,000 factories solely for tractor production, and there are 500,000 tractors in the territories of Russia. However, interesting things are happening in Europe. The year is 1933. Hitler is on the stage, and Germany is slowly beginning to sow the seeds of World War II. Nazism is coming to power. Revolutionary forces are emerging in Germany and Italy. They are rebelling against the government. Of course, at first America and the United Kingdom are very happy because they enjoy the turmoil in Europe. However, something interesting happens in 1938. Hitler, trusting that Europe would remain silent, said, "If I approach a little closer, you will see that I explained this to you during World War II." He says, "What would happen if I took a little land from Poland?" First, he advances from Czechoslovakia and then, without hesitation, continues to take land from Poland. Normally, these two countries that rely on France are losing their territories without even understanding what is happening. Russians are very smart. They signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939. Just like China, they are dependent. They think about what will happen next. But, since Hitler was not a very honorable person, he later breaks this agreement. And on June 22, 1941, a sudden attack begins towards Soviet territory. And it starts to advance rapidly into Soviet lands. Interestingly, in the territories they occupy, the Russians are striving to steal something from them in order to see their technologies and factories. Of course, there is a small cleverness here about the Russians, and that is Stalin's intelligence on one hand. On one hand, while losing land, 600,000 workers are rapidly moving back to 32,000 industrial establishments. They are providing raw materials by loading them onto trains and wagons. They are quickly transporting machinery backward. Of course, even if Hitler does not find much to loot in the places he advances, he still seizes technology that will later contribute to the development of various German automotive industries and tank production. Hitler's Barbarossa operation was quickly advancing into Russian territory until 1943. However, later on, with America's and England's participation in the war from the African continent as well as from the European continent, America is changing the balance of power significantly. As you know, I have also explained World War II. It fails at the siege of Leningrad. It cannot hold on to the lands of Stalingrad. It releases the prisoners and begins to retreat quickly. This time, the situation turns around. This time Hitler is fleeing, and the Russians are chasing him. They chase so much that in 1945, the Russians advance to Berlin and divide Germany in two. Germany is now in two parts. Some of it belongs to Russia. I had mentioned Charlie Checkpoint, etc. You can hear about how Germany was divided into three parts from there, after World War II. World War II had greatly benefited the Russians because they had significantly increased their power and territory, but the Cold War years began. It was now clear that they were enemies with America, so much so that as the years went by, Russia began to consolidate its territories. But America established NATO. NATO was under America's control. The United States was deploying missiles in the territories of NATO member countries. These missiles were also aimed at Russia. Therefore, in response to the possibility of the Russians advancing into Europe, America was securing itself and its allies in Europe. Meanwhile, a war broke out in Vietnam, a land that had nothing to do with this place. America tried to bring peace here. Of course, I'm being ironic. It tried to take control because communism was spreading as the Russians were spreading Soviet communism around the world. America entered Vietnam but got stuck and couldn't get out. And the faction supported by Russia won in Vietnam. They had divided it into North and South at that time. By the 1970s, the Russians had gradually reached their final borders. Interestingly, they had indeed conquered all of Asia up to the Bering Strait, and had also entered the space race. They established Comecon for commercial cooperation. Later, the European Economic Community will compete with it, as you know. The Soviet Union became one of the world's largest powers in the fields of energy, iron ore, steel, oil, cement, and artificial fertilizers. They were doing something very clever, which was to increase the purchasing power and welfare level of the core population. Between 1970 and 1985, they raised wages, salaries, and the money that officials and workers received by more than 50%. The same period saw an increase in taxes on luxury goods, while prices for essential goods were kept stable, helping to curb inflation. With the rising purchasing power of the Russian people, the availability of free education, free health care, the provision of free secondary and higher education, municipal support for housing rents, and free public transportation, along with scholarships, their loyalty to Russia has increased. During the Brezhnev era, agreements were made with many countries in Europe, including France and the Federal Republic of Germany, and energy pipeline projects were initiated to transport natural gas from Siberia. However, by 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in a way that would lead to the end of the USSR. And unfortunately, he was a very unsuccessful manager, had many wrong policies. There were various corruptions, and the economic collapse of the people began. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev announced his resignation due to failure. That same midnight, the red flag was lowered at the Kremlin. Instead, the Russian flag was raised, declaring the dissolution of the Soviet Socialist Republic Union. The rest is known. In 1999, Putin was the prime minister and then moved to the presidency, in a way that allowed him to remain in power indefinitely. When asked about his 20 years of government, he said the following: "It was a troubled time. People were in a difficult situation. Even the soldiers were not receiving their salaries. But now, under my leadership, everything has changed for the better. The situation has not only turned positive, we have come a long way. We have rebuilt our military and weaponry. Russia has reached its rightful place in international relations." Yes, as you can see how far the Russians have come today. I talked about what happened to Russia in World War II, but I have not yet explained how Russia enriched its economy and industry. Therefore, I will discuss the Lenin-Stalin period and the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in detail in the video. Then we will look at how Russia became wealthy. See you in the next video.